All right, guys, welcome back. Sorry for the slight delay there, but I'd like to introduce Tom Hadden. You have brushed your hair, Tom. I was only joking last night.
I did. I told you I'd brush my hair. I'd even shave a little bit.
So Tom is our COO in the US. As I mentioned earlier, Tom and Kathy have decades and decades of experience each in this space and love forms. So Tom is going to talk to you in a bit more detail than I did earlier about some of the things they've got going on over there. I'm going to drive your slides, Tom, so shout when you need changes.
I will do so. Thank you, Simon. Excuse me. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon over in Bristol. What I want to do is cover a little bit in more detail about what it takes to actually be a carrier here in the United States, what we're doing with Simwood, some of the terms that we tend to use. So if Simon, if you'd bring up the hierarchy for our, actually it would be our second slide. There we go. What tends to confuse a lot of people is the terminology that we tend to use in the United States. We're a bit of a redheaded stepchild, as they call us over here. We have our own way of doing things and not always as easy and compliant with the VoIP market, as has been mentioned earlier. 2018, we started to see, as Alan talked about, the introduction of VoIP into our core systems. The reason I bring this up is we all think in the VoIP market of prefixes and numbers and things that we dial. In the United States, in our core systems, the concept of just dialing a prefix didn't really exist. Everything was done by country code, LATA, and OCN. I'm going to get into these in just a little bit. So I've laid out some of the terms here for you that we tend to use. In our core switches with our ILECs, our independent telephone carriers have been here for 50, 60 years, interconnecting to each other. What we find is LATA OCN is the core way that we interconnect, the core way that we bill each other in what we call our carrier access billing system, CABs. We then have interconnects in each LATA, which then will relate to our local routing numbers, our LMP. Key here is local, and that's what I'm going to show you here in a minute. You can't just be a carrier in the United States and port in anywhere that you want. You have to actually have access in that local market. So that requires that you have a switch in a given LATA. In a state, you have an operating carrier company code. You have a SILI code, which is our name identification for the switch that's in that area. We have an access homing tandem, which is our switch homing. We are located within a given rate center. In Canada, we call those Canadian liers. And then we can use our LRN and LMPs to actually port into that local area. We break our numbers obviously down, as all of you I know are aware, by NPA, NXX, and block ID. Most people think of our routing as one being the country code, then an NPA and an NXX, when in reality, for us to convert to true LATA OCN, it's an NPA, it's an NXX, and then the very next digit, which is our block ID, that really relates to a OCN in a given state or crossing state boundaries. Then we have different identifications for SS7, of course, in our point codes, which I know everyone's familiar with. Our wireless carriers and how we identify whether the call is wireless. And then we do lookups to our LERG tables for our carrier codes, our COC types, and then our MTA boundaries, which few have heard of. And we'll get into that. If you go on to the next slide, Simon. This is just when we speak of country code 1, everybody usually refers to the United States. Carrier code 1 is actually the North American Numbering Plan Administration, which is Canada, the United States, and the Atlantic Islands. So we tend to always think country code 1 being the United States, but it's really not just the US. If you want to go on to the next slide then, Simon. That was just a bit of an indication of breaking down. These are what we refer to in our old LATAs. I put these up here. I'm not going to go through each one of them in great detail to bore everybody with them, but this is how we break down our lattice within the United States, how they relate to the old RBOCs, the old carriers, ILECs as we refer to them, within our 50 states. Now take a look, Simon, if you would, at the next slide. These are actually the lattices that reside within the United States alone. For Simwood, what does this mean? This means in each and every one of those locations, we have to have an interconnect point. We have to be filed as a CLEC, competitive local exchange carrier, within that given state. We have to have PUC license, public utilities license, to operate within that state. We then interconnect within that LATA to the given carriers that provide local access. We can then port in and out, and we can also operate our own local telephone numbers. What that means for us is exactly what I've put up there. That's roughly 223 different switching interconnection points to connect to all the carriers, or interconnection through our tandems. If you'd move on to the next slide for me, Simon. So the next thing we have to look at is our operating company number. This gets into how we operate our tariffs, how we provide pricing, and trade with other carriers. A CLEC operates one OCN per state, not per LATA, but per state. These tie into our FCC tariff number 4. They're assigned, as you will see in the LERD tables. They're specific to how we would actually assign rates for a rate center in a given LATA. If you want to move on to one more slide for me, Simon, if you would. MTA boundaries. This rabbit hole kind of gets deep as we move on to all these. There are also MTA boundaries. Now, these refer to our wireless. So when we look at interconnecting with wireless carriers, we have to look at, is that call an inter or intra MTA boundary? We can then determine the rate. If it's a local MTA boundary, then we can exchange between wireless to wireless at a very low cost between carriers within those boundaries. If it's inter MTA boundary, then there are obviously IXC charges that would apply, inter-exchange carrier, that would apply. If you want to move on to the next one. So let's talk a little bit about some of the carriers that we have here. We have our incumbent local exchange carriers that everybody's familiar with, the AT&Ts, the Level 3s, the CenturyLinks have been here forever, Verizon's. The introduction back in '96 of CLECs, the competitive local exchange carriers, which allowed licensed carriers to come in and buy unbundled elements and use that local last mile fiber, last mile copper of the carriers. Last year, we saw the introduction really of, it was really in 2017, but really became more prominent in 2018, the IPES ruling. IPES is actually not a PUC ruling, but an FCC ruling, meaning that it is a national ruling. So it basically says that I'm an internet protocol enabled service, so a VoIP provider. I want access to numbering systems through somebody like MPAC, and I want to be able to get my own numbers, but I'm not actually a licensed carrier, and I'm not authorized to interconnect with other licensed carriers and operate local facilities as a carrier, and I'm not regulated by the Public Utilities Commission of each and given state. So IPES gives you kind of a way to get numbers, whereas CLEC gives us a license to operate as an actual carrier interconnected with ILECs in each given state. A CLEC is licensed by the state, an IPES is licensed by the FCC. Excuse me. Then there are IXCs. IXCs are licensed not in all states, but probably about 35 of our 50 states. An IXC is an inter-exchange carrier, meaning I'm going to be licensed to carry traffic from one state to another, an inter-exchange. In some states, the reason they have IXCs, and where applicable, we have filed for IXC license on top of our CLEC license. This enables us to file tariffs and set rates for charging a carrier-to-carrier interconnection from state to state. In other words, the long-distance provider, as opposed to the local tariff, which is under your CLEC license. And then obviously, one that was our hardest so far to get, which is our FCC 214 license. This is one that required, we went through the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, all the backgrounds that pertained to myself, Simon Graham, a few others in the company, to make sure that a U.S.-owned Simwood Inc. was licensed to operate as a facilities-based carrier worldwide under U.S. law. So next slide, if you would, Simon. So the FCC did approve us as a facilities-based international carrier. We can interconnect with other international carriers, and we can do that on a facilities base as approved by the FCC in the United States. We are still pending, which would have and should have been our easiest application, which is our IPAS application. So it's still pending approval as they still continue to look at the international segment of how Simwood is actually owned. That should be coming fairly shortly. Next slide, if you would, Simon. So this is what it's meant. So I went through everything else to get to this point. Basically, I think because it's job security for me, if you will, it makes it look like we're really, really busy. What did we do the last year? Well, here's where we stand today. We are approved in Idaho and Kentucky, Missouri, Montana, North Dakota, Oregon, Texas, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. Those CLEC states have been approved. We are filing for our SILIs in every LATA within every one of those states, which is about 135 different switching interconnect points. We have additionally filed for licenses in Arkansas, California, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, New York, and West Virginia. Those are filed, and we are going through a series of question and answers, in some cases, public hearings and meetings where we have to appear either in person or in video conference like this and testify before the board of directors of the Utilities Commission of the given states. Once the questioning period's over and they've confirmed that we have the technical expertise, the financial expertise, everything that we need to operate as a carrier, then those will subsequently be approved. And then in process, I have Indiana, Louisiana, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, South Dakota, Virginia, and Washington. Those are ones I'm working on right now. The applications haven't been submitted, but what we're working on getting submitted shortly. We plan on having at least 20 to 30 of the states completed this year. So we would be that would equate to about 185 different switching interconnection points and tandems in the 50 states, 30 of them done within the 2020 year, and the rest remaining to be in 2021. Next slide, if you would, Simon, please. Oh, well, see, that was easy. Are there any questions that anybody? I know I did some of that fairly quickly. I didn't want to bore everybody. I guess the point that I wanted to make in all of this, if you will, is when we're dealing with VoIP in the United States, as Alan mentioned, it is new. The problem is that VoIP doesn't exist as a core technology within our ILECs yet, because we communicate in LATA OCNs, we communicate in rate centers, we communicate as SILIs. That's built into our core SS7, our core billing, if you will, in cabs. And most of the newer VoIP equipment deals with a NPA and NXX, or a prefix, if you will, that routes a number. And it's that billing component that allows a carrier to submit a record to the carrier access billing system to exchange records with another carrier for how we settle the origination versus termination side of a record, that is keeping VoIP from becoming the core backbone of everything in the United States at this moment. We're getting closer. And most of you out there are the people that are making those changes. So I wanted to get in front of you. Our basic technology is there. And while we're thinking of building these larger scale switches, I would really appreciate if anybody wants to reach out. I'm willing to help anybody or talk to anybody on what it actually takes to implement that core switching into the United States as well. Thank you. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer any.
Any questions for Tom? No?
Simon?
No. Oh. In which case, Tom, thank you very, very much. Hopefully you guys get some appreciation for the scale of what we're doing over there. If you think in the EU, there's what, 27 countries, or is it 26 now, each with their own subset of European legislation, their own interpretation of things, their own different licensing regimes. In the US, there's 50. We're planning on having 30, which is more than the EU starts with by the end of the year. It's a huge undertaking that we can't downplay or overstate enough, rather. So thank you to Tom and Kathy for their efforts. And if there's any questions come to you after Tom goes, by all means ask them on the community Slack or catch one of us and we can ask Tom directly for you. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.